If you feel like buying a home in America has gotten so much harder, you're actually not imagining it. It definitely has gotten much more difficult. And here I'm not just talking about the rising prices or the high mortgage interest rates, though those are absolutely barriers for a lot of people, but it's also about who buyers are now competing with. Because the way I see it is that the biggest threat to home ownership right now isn't necessarily the person that's purchasing in cash when you're going to be mortgaging, though that's certainly going to make it more difficult for you. But it's also, maybe more importantly, who you're competing with. And there's a coordinated buying spree that's happening behind the scenes that you need to be aware of. And so today we're going to talk about who is really purchasing America's homes and why does home ownership feel so much harder to attain right now in today's society and environment, and what role do policies such as the big beautiful bill play in shaping out the housing market. I've compiled the information from articles and recent bills that have been passed. A lot of research went into it, but disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, and so this does not constitute legal advice. Let's get into it. We're going to start talking about what we actually know. Since the pandemic, home prices across the United States have increased by over 40%. And certain pockets across the United States have seen far worse increases, such as in Tampa or Phoenix, for example. And so if anybody didn't buy back in the day and they're looking to purchase now, many of them are going to find the market right now unattainable. At the same time, mortgage interest rates are far higher than they were back in 2021. At the lowest, it was 2.65% back in 2021. Remember those days? We should have all bought back then. And that's actually one of the reasons what fueled the frenzy back in 2021 into 2022 and 2023 was the low mortgage interest rate. And so a lot of people did rush to the market to purchase, and that's one of the reasons the prices went up so quickly. But now the mortgage interest rate for a 30-year conventional loan is much closer to 7%. As a matter of fact, when I just checked, it was roughly estimated 6.75%. And so, for example, somebody that's looking to purchase a $500,000 home right now is getting far less home because the price increases, but also if they're mortgaging, it's going to be so much more expensive. But here's what you also need to know. While a lot of first-time home buyers, for example, were getting completely cut out of the market because it's just gotten very expensive for them, investors came in still and continued to purchase homes. And here I'm not talking about just mom and pop landlords, but I'm talking about Wall Street backed firms, private equity giants, and global funds buying single family homes, and often in bulk. Now, it's also true, and this is, besides the headlines that we see, say, in relations to BlackRock, institutional investors are still a relatively small piece of the housing pie. But what is also true is that when they do own homes across the United States, it's very much in certain different clusters, such as Atlanta, Charlotte, Tampa, and Jacksonville. And in some of these areas, they could own up to 25% of homes. And so these are people who are not putting down roots in the communities. They're portfolios, businesses, and it's working for them. According to a 2024 analysis by the National Association of Realtors, it showed that first-time home buyers purchased approximately 24% of all U.S. homes, which is actually the lowest in decades. Now, in the meantime, smaller investors, many of which are still backed by major financial firms, actually scooped up 1 in 5 homes during that same time period. And according to the latest stats that I've been able to tap into, looking at Q1 2025, investors purchased almost 27% of all homes sold, which is making it harder and harder for first-time home buyers to compete with, especially those that are looking to purchase a primary home. The reality here is that we're not just facing an affordability crisis here in the US, but we're also facing an ownership crisis. And so homes aren't just vanishing, but what's truly happening here is that homes are changing hands, and increasingly who's purchasing homes are not those that are actually going to be living in them, but those people who are purchasing them for investment purposes. But why does this matter? Well, first of all, they're tapping into supply that otherwise would be available for all these other buyers. And it's especially those investors that are larger types of investors that are going to be playing by different rules strictly because they have a lot of money backing them up. And if they're purchasing entire developments, for example, or homes in bulk, they can influence prices and supply in ways that a regular seller or buyer never could. And because they're driven by profit, I mean, that's why they got into that type of business to begin with. They're not there to build communities. They're there to make more and more money. It's as plain and simple as that. Now let's talk about the big beautiful bill, which was just signed into law in July 2025 and was actually pitched as a win for economic stability. But how does it actually affect housing? Let's talk about it and let's actually break it down. So first off, it locked in the permanent deductibility of mortgage insurance, which is really good news for FHA and VA buyers. And that essentially helps borrowers with lower down payment, which means that these buyers who put down less than 20% and so have to pay a PMI can now write that off permanently on their taxes. It also permanently extends the $750,000 cap on the mortgage interest deduction. Why does this matter? Well, if you take out a mortgage up to $750,000, which many of you will, you can still deduct the interest you pay on your taxes. And this is especially relevant in high-cost housing markets, so places like California, New York, or even parts of Florida where home prices are high and people often need larger loans. For real estate investors, the big beautiful bill is a big win, far more so than for first-time home buyers, because they're getting a lot of tax credits where first-time home buyers aren't really getting as much assistance as maybe some of them would have hoped. So what are some of the tax benefits for these types of real estate investors? So let's take the 20% deduction for business income, for example, QBI, which is now permanent. And that lowers taxes for many real estate professionals and LLCs. It modified the low-income housing credit, and it kind of sounds like it went towards first-time home buyers, but that's not the case. It actually is good for investors and developers, because what it does do is it funds and helps expand rental supply by providing investors an opportunity to use these credits to reduce their tax liability while also earning returns from affordable housing projects. And I'm sure you've heard of 1031 exchanges, which is still going to be allowed in this bill, and it essentially lets real estate investors defer paying capital gains taxes when they sell one investment property and they use the proceeds to buy another like-kind property. There's also interest on investment property loans, which can still be deducted, and that's going to help reduce costs. Opportunity zones, which get even more incentives now, encouraging investments in certain areas, and typically opportunity zones are in designated areas where there's low income or economically distressed neighborhoods. And so investors can receive significant tax breaks if they're willing to put money into development projects and businesses in these opportunity zones. I think this is actually a great initiative and kind of works the supply angle here. And now there's the 100% bonus depreciation, which is permanent. And bonus depreciation is a tax rule that allows real estate investors and business owners to immediately deduct the cost of certain assets instead of spreading the deduction out over many, many years, which means paying far less of taxes. But here's what the big beautiful bill did not do. So first of all, there's no new federal down payment assistance. There's also no national first-time buyer tax credit. And HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofit program wasn't expanded. And this is also on top of other affordable housing initiatives that actually saw cuts. The big beautiful bill really focuses on providing huge tax advantages for investors and for people who already own homes. There's less support for, say, first-time home buyers. What the bill also does is it really does work kind of the supply angle here, and hoping that, with these tax advantages, there is more of a push to increase supply. If demand stays the same, supply goes up, then that should be favorable for first-time home buyers as well, as long as the homes that are being built are actually for first-time home buyers when it comes to the pricing. I also want to make sure that you realize when I say these provisions are now permanent, what it essentially means is it doesn't have any built-in expiration date. And so it's a tax code that is essentially indefinite, and it can only change if Congress actively changes it later through new legislation. I also want to be clear here that I'm not saying that investors are the enemy here. They're absolutely not. And I work with a lot of investors, and I've helped plenty of high net worth customers find their maybe second home or perhaps their investment property here in Florida. And I think that's part of a healthy housing market ecosystem. But the point that I do want to drive here is that the balance is getting out of whack because we're building a housing market in the United States, a housing system that rewards ownership, but not necessarily getting to ownership. And so a lot of first-time homebuyers are going to almost be at the mercy of these, investors that are doing pretty well because of the tax incentives doing the right thing. And so I wish there would have been more support for first-time home buyers. And so just imagine, perhaps giving first-time home buyers a credit towards closing costs or perhaps the down payment that could have gotten a lot of first-time home buyers to actually go out and achieve a home purchase. So that's, the type of assistance that we're not seeing. And I think that's kind of a miss. But I also know what some people are going to say. They're going to say, well, Katrina, if that happens, then home prices could artificially get increased because now there's more demand because of that assistance. And that is true if the supply angle wouldn't have been worked on. But because there's so much assistance for investors and there's also motivation to hopefully bring more supply to the market, that if both worked in perfect harmony, $15,000 credit for a first-time home buyer, wouldn't have increased prices if supply is also going up. But what it does do is get more buyers into the housing market because they're getting assistance as well. And so the reality is that many buyers are still facing affordability issues. We have mortgage rates that are still elevated. We have tariffs, inflation, which is causing the Fed to kind of keep steady on the interest rate. And this is what I call the doom loop. We finalize shelter. We turn homes into investment vehicles, and now we're struggling to find space for people who just want to live in these homes. If we don't start rebalancing these incentives, what we're going to do is continue to be in this doom loop where we're fostering a market where fewer and fewer people are actually going to be able to afford a roof over their head. And I don't think that's where we want to go necessarily. So what can you do? Well, first of all, continue to stay informed. And here I don't mean just looking at listings. Just understand the local housing market, what's driving supply and demand. Are there certain housing policies that you should know of that could perhaps influence your financial options? And if you're somebody that is looking to purchase right now, you're a buyer, but you're having a hard time getting to the housing market because you feel it's too expensive, look for cooling markets. There are going to be some markets that are going to be much easier to get into. And then also, if you care about the future of housing, I would say just speak up and perhaps, support housing affordability initiatives in your community. Perhaps attend, zoning board meetings. And then ultimately, if you feel like that everybody should have an opportunity to get into the housing market, then advocate for policies that help first-time buyers and working class families, because I believe the home should be for people, not just portfolios. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate you. I'm Katrin. This was my take. I see you guys in my next video. Have a good day.